I'm going to put a quote on the screen and I'm going to make a guess about the first thought that jumps into your mind when it appears. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than an end to capitalism. So my prediction is that many of you, before you even saw the full quote appear, took notice of and possibly took offense to the font. Let's talk about Comic Sans and capitalism. And if you hang in there, we'll move on from capitalism to talk about metaphysics and theories about the fundamental nature of the universe. In part 1 of this series, we went through the history of the desktop interface from its inception at the Xerox Corporation to today. And if you didn't see part 1, the summary is, not much has changed since the 1970s. We'll start this video looking at one brief and quickly abandoned attempt to shift away from the standard desktop, which also serves as the origin story of Comic Sans. Just a few months before the release of Windows 95, Microsoft released Bob, which threw out the desktop icons and doubled down on skeuomorphism. Skeuomorphism is when digital design imitates real-world objects to make them feel familiar, like a floppy disk for saving files or a trash bin for removing files. Digital skeuomorphism was the major innovation of Xerox's graphical user interface. With Bob, instead of the gray void background of Windows, all the skeuomorphic points of interaction were situated within the various rooms of a digital home. And this was remarkable in that it tried to make the interface more warm and inviting for users who weren't doing office work, like who wants to think about filing cabinets and manila folders and paper trays filling up with inane memos from middle management when you can think about a crackling fire and a grandfather clock and an adorable and loyal canine companion. This good boy who follows you around in your home is Rover. Rover speaks to you through these little speech bubbles, offering suggestions about how to navigate the interface. And a designer at Microsoft named Vincent Conair developed a font face for these speech bubbles that was fun and whimsical and mimicked the style of comic book and comic strip lettering. But Rover ended up using a standard serif font because Conair didn't finish Comic Sans in time for the release of Bob. Comic Sans showed up as a standard font in later versions of Windows, and soon it was everywhere, often in places it shouldn't be, which was the real reason behind its criticism. The font itself is fine. So although it was cold and gray and office-oriented, designed by a corporation for corporate purposes, users had internalized the affordance of the desktop, and that's what began to feel comfortable and familiar, even more comfortable and familiar than a dog and a fireplace. So Microsoft Bob flopped, sold about 60,000 copies, and was quietly shelved as Windows returned to the status quo. Speaking of the dog, we sadly never saw Rover again after Bob fizzled out, but a sort of echo of Rover made its way into Windows 97. Its name was Clippy. It was an anthropomorphic paperclip, and it was very, very helpful. So why are we stuck with a corporate interface interaction modality that was invented a half a century ago? Why has virtually nothing changed? It's because we don't see it anymore. We've so deeply internalized its mechanics that it's just like the air we breathe or the water a fish swims in, and when something becomes invisible, it seems inevitable. It stops being questioned, and that's not a great thing for end users. The desktop was meant to ease white-collar workers into a new and unfamiliar technology. It wasn't meant to be the pinnacle of user interaction for all time. We can do better, it just doesn't occur to enough of us to demand better, to ask visionaries to imagine something new. I mean, we modified icons and the drag and drop mechanic to accommodate touchscreens, but that's about it for innovation over the past 50 years. Which brings us back to our opening quote. Most of the world has so thoroughly metabolized the principles of capitalism, the profit motive, competition, the end goal of perpetual growth and wealth accumulation, that to switch lanes to a different mechanism for running society would be like rewriting the code of the operating system of human civilization, and that's much harder to imagine than the world just coming to a catastrophic end. We can get our heads around an apocalypse.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it! There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. The world is a business, Mr. Beale.
Capitalism deflects criticism by assigning an air of inevitability to its mechanics. Its defenders frame the affordance of the profit motive as the only handle we can apply to move innovation forward. It's meant to be ambient, it's meant to be invisible, not even considered and certainly not questioned, And what happens if you try to criticize capitalism?
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
We're not meant to think of the art of the possible in terms of 3 dimensions we can maneuver around in, or even a flat plane where we can zig and zag. We're meant to think of the decision about how to manage society as a single line. On one side of the line is capitalism, and the other side is totalitarianist communism. There are no other options. You're either fully on board with a market-driven consumerist society, or you're with the godless communists who will take away everything you hold dear and transform our prosperous nation into something resembling the deepest pit of hell. These boogeymen are constructed to scare us away from exploring the art of the possible. The threats are there to keep us not just living within the illusion of constraint, but to perpetually reinforce the constraints ourselves. We're meant to focus on the pretty desktop icons, the shiny jewels on the surface, because anytime we look beyond the interface, we see the real cost of sustaining endless economic growth. We see the human sacrifices taking place beneath the surface.
You want to be fooled.
But the boundaries of both capitalism and the desktop are not the limits of what's possible. They're just the limits of what we've been taught to accept. We're absolutely steeped in default beliefs, wearing the disguise of self-evident truths. And it's no coincidence that the primary interface for our increasingly digital lives is itself steeped in the imagery of the corporate office, which houses all the gears that power the capitalist machine. It trains us to flatten our thoughts and emotions and frame everything in terms of work and the stuff we can accumulate as a result of work. It trains us to view everything through the lens of materialism. It's also no coincidence that as our society has become increasingly dependent on consumerist materialism, our default consensus understanding of reality has become increasingly dominated by the tenets of scientific materialism. This is the view that physical substances are what constitute all of reality. All experiences, perceptions, and phenomena are a result of interactions between matter. Nothing exists that can't be measured and quantified by our physical senses and our technology. With maybe an exception for consciousness, but elusive as consciousness is, the materialist views it as a foregone conclusion that it's just an illusory phenomenon that emerges from the brain's neural complexity. But materialism is a theoretical model that describes one possible fundamental nature of reality. Other models conflict with the assumptions of materialism, but it's still taken for granted by the majority of educated people that materialism is the only valid prism for understanding reality. Like capitalism, its assumptions are just the background hum of default reality. And, like capitalism, to push back against these assumptions will activate ideological defense mechanisms. The boogeyman of capitalism is the specter of communism, while the boogeyman of materialism is superstition. Any deviation from the materialist worldview is met with snickers and ridicule, or even dire warnings about humanity slipping back into a dark age where dangerous superstitions dominated our thinking and inhibited progress.
Oh, come on! Yes, sir.
Now, if you're a scientific materialist watching this video and screaming at the screen, let me do my best to advocate your point of view so this video isn't just an echo chamber of my own perspective. The scientific method, based on observability, repeatability, and falsifiability, has been a profoundly productive framework for understanding and manipulating the physical manifestations of the universe. It's the basis for all physical technology. I wouldn't be able to record this video without solid, grounded science. It's the foundation of effective medicine and lots of other breakthroughs that have improved our lives at large. But even conceding that, the materialists will still be salty about my classification of materialism as a default belief based on a metaphysical assumption. They'll say it's not a belief, it's a framework supported by evidence. We've built reliable models that explain light and gravity and time and energy. Adding unmeasurable metaphysical concepts adds confusion and unnecessary complexity. I think that's a fair characterization of the materialist viewpoint, but if you don't, please let me have it in the comments. Tell me where I went wrong.
From nowhere appears a fireball smaller than an atom. 10 trillion times hotter than the core of the sun.
Now, here's my answer to the materialist viewpoint. Materialism cannot empirically prove its own starting premise, that everything arises from matter and nothing else. The dogmatic assertion that the universe sprang forth from nothing requires a leap of metaphysical faith. I'll let Terence McKenna have a crack at this.
It was called the Big Bang. And so you say, well, one singularity, essentially what science is saying is give us one free miracle, and then we can run it from there.
Ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of being, existence, and reality, and it categorizes entities and their relationships to one another. So I implore all materialists to embrace a measure of ontological humility.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
If you want to avoid dealing with the complexity that metaphysics introduces, that's totally fine. And I don't blame you, it's a tricky business with a lot of potential intellectual and emotional pitfalls. But it's important, if you care about intellectual honesty, to concede that some questions about the nature of reality require a different set of affordances to deal with and answer. And even the term answer is problematic because the word answer implies some sort of termination point, a satisfying quantifiable platform to land on that yields to language and rational deconstruction. With that said, let's introduce an actual framework that operates outside of materialism. Let's talk about ontological idealism. There's the subjective idealism of George Berkeley, who the University of California, Berkeley is named after, where reality is entirely made up of perception. Matter only persists because it's continually observed. And you may ask, what about when it's not being observed by a person or creature or an instrument? Well, Berkeley's answer is that everything is constantly being perceived by a vast universal consciousness. And that's what holds everything together, down to subatomic particles. Another flavor of idealism is objective idealism. The objective idealism of Hegel paints a picture where this universal mind isn't just something that perceives and sustains everything, but the universal mind is the one fundamental thing, and everything else, including individual consciousness, is just an expression of that one mind. Basically, reality is the universal mind unfolding and perceiving itself. Then there's panpsychism. This one's been gaining a lot of traction lately. This posits that all matter has some degree of consciousness. Consciousness or proto-consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, but not necessarily the fundamental property. It says that mind and matter are inseparable and interdependent. Experientialism suggests that reality is shaped by the interactions of sentient beings. Each individual is a unit of consciousness that acts like the neurons in our brain. Experientialists don't see consciousness as an emergent property of neural activity in the brain. They see the universe itself as an emergent property of all these nodes of consciousness that we call you and me and every other conscious being. One of the most well-known experientialist philosophers is a man named William James. He's considered the father of American psychology. I could do a whole video series on him, but for now I'll just point out that he was a mentor and a teacher to a guy named E.B. Holt, who was in turn the mentor of J.J. Gibson, who coined the term affordances that I introduced in part 1. And if you missed it, you really should go back and watch part 1 and like it, and like this video and leave a comment and subscribe. It'll go a long way toward making this channel grow. In the next video, we'll talk about consciousness and idealism and how those things relate to user interfaces. We'll try to punch through this constraining box of default reality and see what other possibilities there are to consider when we think about the fundamental nature of the universe. And to think we got here from Comic Sans. I hope you enjoyed the ride.